They called me a dreamer, a failure. My own parents laughed when I quit the safe path to start a tiny woodworking shop in my garage. 5 years later, the company that fired them is mine. And today, I'm handing them their new job offers, under my name on the door. I grew up in Cedar Falls, Iowa, a blue-collar town where everyone believed in clocking in, collecting a paycheck, and keeping their head down. My parents, Mark and Linda, were no exception. They'd both worked at Hartwell Manufacturing for over 20 years, climbing to mid-management. To them, stability was sacred, but from the time I was a teenager, I had a different itch. I loved building furniture, fixing things, taking old wood, and giving it new life. By the time I hit college, my dorm room looked like a mini workshop. And while my friends were lining up internships, I spent weekends selling handmade shelves and desks at local fairs. It wasn't flashy, but it felt like mine. My parents saw it as a hobby at best, a distraction at worst. Every Sunday dinner turned into the same lecture. "Ethan, you're throwing away your future. Nobody makes real money making coffee tables," my dad would sigh. My mom would nod and ask if I'd applied to any real companies yet. It wasn't cruel. It was almost automatic. They truly thought they were saving me from myself. After graduation, I turned down a salaried offer and moved into a tiny loft above a mechanic's shop to start my own woodworking studio. My parents were stunned. My dad called it a midlife crisis at 23. My mom cried. Friends whispered that I was crazy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that if I didn't try now, I'd regret it forever. The first year was brutal. Cold winters, late nights, and orders so small I was barely scraping by. Yet, every time I posted a new design online, a few more orders trickled in. Social media became my storefront, and little by little the numbers started climbing. Still, at family gatherings the jokes flew. My dad would introduce me as the starving artist. My mom would add, "He'll come around eventually." Then Hartwell Manufacturing, the company where they'd built their entire careers, began cutting costs. Departments merged, benefits shrank. They didn't say much to me about it, but I could tell the stress was eating at them. Meanwhile, my business was slowly shifting from custom orders to small batch production. A boutique retailer in Des Moines placed a big order. Then an online home goods platform reached out. I was hiring part-time help, learning about supply chains, negotiating contracts. The hobby was becoming a real business. I kept my head down, worked, and said little. They mocked my risk, but I was learning to turn that sting into fuel. What none of us knew then was that the company they worshipped was heading for a sale, and I was on a path that would make me one of the bidders. By my third year in business, the shop above the mechanic's garage could barely hold the orders. I'd gone from one-off coffee tables to full living room sets, and customers were waiting months. Instead of panicking, I reinvested every spare dollar into equipment and people. A retired carpenter from down the street helped me set up a small production line. 2 local college kids managed the online store. We were no longer a hobby shop. We were a lean, growing manufacturer. On the family front, nothing had changed. My dad still sent me job listings just in case. My mom still told neighbors I was between careers. At Thanksgiving, my uncle asked me if I was finally ready to get a real job. I smiled, passed the gravy, and said nothing. Inside, I was keeping score. Their words still hurt, but they also lit a fire I couldn't put out. Then one night, scrolling through business news, a headline caught my eye. Hartwell Manufacturing exploring strategic sale. I blinked twice. Hartwell, my parents' fortress of stability, was on the auction block. The article explained that a private equity firm wanted to break it up, sell off the real estate, and move production overseas. Thousands of jobs were at risk. My parents had no clue. Management hadn't told staff yet. I stared at my laptop, heart pounding. For years, I'd dreamed of proving myself to them. Now, the company they'd used as proof of my failure was teetering, and I, the starving artist, had a thriving business in the same sector. Could I actually buy it? It sounded insane, but the more I thought, the more it made sense. Hartwell had machinery, skilled workers, and distribution contracts. My company had brand momentum, online presence, and new designs. Combined, they'd be a powerhouse. The next morning, I called a contact I'd met at a trade show, a mergers and acquisitions attorney in Chicago. Hypothetically, I asked, how hard would it be for a small but profitable company to bid on a distressed manufacturer? He didn't laugh. If your numbers are solid and you can raise capital, he said, you've got a shot. He introduced me to a local bank and an angel investor group that loved underdog stories. Over the next few weeks, I prepared presentations, forecasts, and a financing plan, all while my parents still thought I was making end tables. At home, the cracks at Hartwell began to show. My dad came home quiet and angry. My mom worried aloud about pensions. One Sunday dinner, she sighed, "Sometimes I wish you'd gone into a stable field like us. At least you'd have security." I bit my tongue. If only she knew what I was planning. Negotiations with the sellers were intense. I was the smallest bidder on paper, but my proposal kept production in Iowa and preserved most jobs, something no other buyer promised. That gave me leverage. "You're the only one talking about the people," one board member told me. "The others just see scrap metal." After a month of meetings, late-night calls, and frantic spreadsheet tweaking, my offer moved to the top of the list. Through it all, I kept a normal face around my parents. I visited their house, asked about work, listened to their frustrations. They still thought I was a dreamer. They had no idea I was fighting to save the very place they worked. Each time they mocked me, gently, almost out of habit, it reminded me to stay quiet. This wasn't about revenge for the sake of revenge. It was about turning the tables with dignity. Finally, in early spring, I got the call. My bid had been accepted, pending financing. I signed a mountain of documents and secured a bridge loan that felt like betting everything I owned. But for the first time, the future felt clear. Hartwell Manufacturing, the emblem of my parents' security, would soon belong to the kid they'd called a starving artist. The closing date was set for 6 weeks out. I kept the news locked down. Only my lawyer, my banker, and my 2 lead employees knew. At night, I'd walk the quiet shop floor, imagining the Hartwell plant humming with new life under our brand. I pictured my parents' faces, not humiliated, but stunned, realizing that the son they'd underestimated had built something powerful and principled. Meanwhile, layoffs began at Hartwell. My dad's department was merged. My mom's position was restructured. They called me separately, venting their fears, never once asking what my company was up to. I listened, offered vague encouragement, and hung up to go back to negotiations. It was surreal. 2 worlds colliding, but only one person aware. As the closing approached, I drafted an internal memo welcoming Hartwell's employees to the new ownership and outlining our commitment to keep operations local. I planned a town hall meeting at the plant on day 1. I wanted the workers to hear from me directly, not just about the acquisition, but about the new vision. At the same time, I prepared a personal letter for my parents. Not a gloating "gotcha" note, but an honest explanation. How their ridicule had pushed me to succeed, how I hoped to honor their coworkers, and how I wanted them to choose their next steps with dignity. Whether they stayed on, retired, or moved elsewhere would be their decision, not mine. But they'd finally see me, not as a hobbyist, but as a builder. Every night before bed, I rehearsed the announcement in my head. My pulse quickened, imagining the silence in that plant's cafeteria when I walked to the podium. This wasn't just a business deal. It was the culmination of every lecture, every smirk, every Sunday dinner when I swallowed my pride. I wasn't out to humiliate my parents. I was out to rewrite the power dynamic and prove that my path, risky, mocked, lonely, had been valid all along. When the final signatures cleared and the wire transfer hit, I sat alone in my tiny loft and exhaled. From a one-room workshop above a mechanic's shop to the owner of the company that had been my parents' world, the arc felt unreal. But the real reveal was still to come. In a few days, everyone, including my parents, would find out who their new boss was. The morning of the announcement dawned cool and bright. A sharp Iowa wind slicing through the parking lot as employees shuffled into the Hartwell cafeteria. My palms were damp around the folder of talking points. A banner reading, "New Ownership, New Vision," hung across the back wall. Dozens of faces, worried, tired, curious, turned toward me as I stepped onto the small stage. Among them, at a table near the middle, sat my parents. My dad's jaw was tight. My mom's hands were clasped in her lap. They had no idea what was coming. I cleared my throat, the microphone squealing softly. "Good morning. My name is Ethan Parker. Some of you may know me as the owner of Parker Designs." A ripple of recognition passed through the crowd. "Today, I'm honored to welcome you to a new chapter. As of this morning, Parker Designs has acquired Hartwell Manufacturing." A collective gasp filled the room. My father blinked. My mother's mouth parted slightly. I continued, voice steady. "I started my business with a single table and a second-hand sander. People, including some in this very room, told me it would never last. But it did, thanks to the same hard work and grit that built this company. That's why my first priority is keeping operations right here in Iowa, protecting jobs and honoring the skills that make Hartwell strong." Applause erupted from the back. I let it roll for a moment before speaking again. "I know change is scary, but this isn't a takeover meant to gut the company. It's a partnership meant to grow it." I looked directly at my parents, and it's proof that paths outside the safe route can lead to stability too. The Q&A began. Workers asked about pensions, shifts, and benefits. I answered each one with clarity. The mood shifted from dread to cautious optimism. By the time the meeting ended, people were clapping, some even smiling. My parents stayed seated, stunned. As the crowd dispersed, I walked over to them. Up close, I saw my father's eyes glistening, my mother's lips trembling. "Ethan," she whispered, You own Hartwell?" I nodded. "Yes, I bought the company, and I'm keeping it here." There was no gloating in my voice, only calm. "I know you've always wanted security for me. I wanted you to have it too. We're not enemies, but I needed you to see who I really am." My dad opened his mouth, then shut it. Finally, he said, "I guess we were wrong." I smiled, extending a hand. "We all have a chance to start fresh. Whether you stay on or move on is your choice." They looked at each other, then at me, stunned but respectful. For the first time in years, the power dynamic had shifted. Not through anger, but through action. My parents saw me not as a failure, but as a leader. And that moment was worth every late night in the workshop. The weeks after the announcement were a blur. Local papers ran headlines like "Former Underdog Buys Hartwell" and "Small-Town Startup Becomes Major Player." Reporters called me the guy who built a business in his garage. But behind the noise, real changes were happening inside the factory. We streamlined production without layoffs, introduced new benefits, and gave workers a voice on the board. For the first time in years, morale climbed instead of crumbled. At home, my phone buzzed constantly. Old classmates wanted jobs. Investors offered partnerships. But the most unexpected messages came from my parents. My mother sent long texts late at night. "We're proud of you. We didn't understand before." My father, not much of a writer, simply sent a photo of the workbench he'd built me as a kid. The caption, "Guess you learned well." I invited them to my office a month later. They walked in quietly, no longer the authority figures of my childhood, but two people carrying regret. We sat across from each other, sunlight spilling across the polished conference table. "I'm not here to gloat," I said. "I'm here to draw boundaries." I explained how their mockery had fueled me but also hurt me, how my business had been my lifeline when their approval was absent. My father rubbed his temples. "We thought we were protecting you from disappointment," he muttered. My mother's eyes brimmed with tears. "We were wrong." I took a deep breath. "I can forgive, but I won't go back to the old dynamic. If you want to be in my life, it has to be mutual respect from here on." They nodded slowly. It wasn't a movie-style reconciliation, no dramatic hugs or sweeping music, but it was honest. And that was enough. That night, I sat alone in the quiet of my workshop, the same one where it all began, running my hands over a slab of oak, breathing in the smell of sawdust. I thought about the boy who once begged his parents to believe in him, and the man who no longer needed their belief to stand tall. Success hadn't been about revenge. It had been about self-respect. Months later, at a community awards dinner, my parents attended not as critics, but as guests. When I went up to accept a plaque for Local Entrepreneur of the Year, I saw them stand and clap. No cameras captured it. But for me, that moment was the real victory, the quiet rewrite of a family story that had once felt unchangeable. In the end, I hadn't just bought the company that fired them. I'd built a life on my own terms, and in doing so, taught all of us what respect really means. Sometimes the sweetest justice isn't humiliation, it's transformation.